Until now, businesses planning to construct new buildings have often been in the dark about what shadows will be created by the structure. Miscalculations can lead to city streets and parks being left in the cold grip of an unexpected shadow.
You don't want to walk into a park and half the day it's dark because you can't see the sun, Those things have got to be taken into account.
A user-friendly computer program designed by the 5 students and presented at the University of Newcastle today means the curtain has now been lifted on the problem. Engineers will simply feed in information about the building and the computer will do the complicated sums involved to come up with a high-quality graphic representation of the shadows it will create. The students say the 6-month-long project involved a lot of brain strain as well as a creative approach to physics, including predicting the behaviour of the sun. The group took on the complex job as part of a push to get final year students involved with business in the real world.
And the idea is for them to go out and apply what they've learned in the other years to real world projects.
The program will now be used by a construction company to assist in its negotiations with council.
Kyle Roddenby and Derek Charge are brimming with excitement over their adventure. The 24-year-olds gave up the modern comforts of Australia to experience the primitive conditions in Papua New Guinea. With a team of guides, the pair set out to climb Mount Samsai on the north coast of the island. They were told they were the first white people to attempt such a feat.
I guess physically we needed to prepare a lot for it. It was tiring, and mentally. The long days of the heat and everything was the worst, I think, in the canoe. It's been day in, day out, and the temperatures would rise to 35 up to 40 degrees Celsius.
They braved crocodile-infested waters. At the same time, they made friends with local tribes. While adjusting to the different environment was a challenge, both Derek and Kyle say the contrast in culture was the most inspiring experience of their trip.
Amazing people, because they just accept us into their house, share their food with us, and we'd just sort of exchange gifts or something and pass on again.
I think really Australian culture could learn a lot from it, just being so family orientated and so caring and so close-knit.
The pair is planning another trek, this time to the Kimberleys in West Australia. Amanda Bolger, NBN News.
Only a few kilometres out of Scone, the homestead fell victim to conspiring elements. Strong winds whipped around the hilltop home, helping flames devour the timber structure. Rain made the steep approach road to the house too slippery for firefighters to drive their heavy vehicles within range to combat the blaze. A tractor was used to haul each fire truck up the track. But there was little that could be done to save the Mooby Road house, the fire beginning to burn itself out before brigades were in place for a fighting chance. The cause of the blaze is still being investigated. And at East Maitland, police scientific investigators are piecing together the circumstances surrounding a fatal early morning fire. Brigades were called to a block of flats in Northumberland Street just after 5:30. After battling through smoke and flame, firefighters found the body of a man in his early 20s lying face down on the floor. A woman in the house managed to escape the blaze by jumping out a window. A neighbour who kicked in a door and attempted to help the victim was forced back by flames.
Sounds like Father Christmas, looks like Father Christmas, feels like Father Christmas. But this is no ordinary Claus, this is Santa with a twist.
I said, hey, there's nothing wrong with being a woman.
After 11 years as the only known professional female Mr. Claus, Margaret Morrison is coming out. Originally embarrassed by her blokey career choice, Marg hid her shameful secret from even her own family.
My own daughter didn't recognise me. She was a 9-year-old at the time. And my mother, who's an actress, was an actress, and she didn't recognise me either.
But Marg is now so at home in her racy red drag and furry facial garb that she's brought her daughter Mary, spelt M-E-R-R-Y, in on the act. Santa says acting in the top job in the Christmas season is such a jolly occupation that more ladies should take on the challenge.
You're only limited by your imagination. I have a vivid and very large imagination. Nothing in this world is impossible.
And for all those kids out there who haven't been good this year, Santa says you'd better watch out because she's planning to gate crash homes in the Hunter area this Christmas morning unannounced.
It's a battle ambulance officers have been waging for years. The officers saying patients' health is being jeopardised with only one officer in a car. That person forced to drive the vehicle while the patient is left unattended in the back. In a controversial move, Newcastle's ambulance officers are taking industrial action.
No single officer will transport a stretcher patient in the Hunter. That can be anything from a heart attack to a person going to an X-ray with a back injury.
More than 10 stations in the Newcastle area use one-person crews. The union says an additional 46 officers are needed to boost numbers to two-person crews. The ambulance service admits it's not a good situation.
There are definitely times when it's not optimal care for the patient to have a single officer present. However, we have a system of backup by other officers when that should arise, the situation arises.
16 additional officers have been put on in the area, but Superintendent Coburn says there are limitations with funding. With the announcement of the work bans, ambulance officers are being moved around to make sure two-person crews are on hand in an emergency. The Health and Research Employees Association, the ambulance union, says this is set to become a hot issue across the state. And if it isn't resolved soon, other unions will be called on to add their weight to the campaign. The ambulance officers will meet again in a week's time to reassess the situation. Peter Ryan, NBN News. The Asian Union was anchored about 8 kilometres off Newcastle. The crew of the rescue chopper was called to the ship around midday after a seaman injured his hand in an accident. But this was not a routine job. Strong winds and heavy seas made a landing on the ship impossible, and paramedics had to be winched on board as the tanker tossed and turned.
Once we got alongside the ship, we could actually see how much the ship was pitching and rolling. So in actual fact, we had to winch the paramedics just above the ship's deck and wait till the ship went back down into the trough until we winched them down.
Paramedics treated the man on the ship, then he was winched back into the chopper in a delicate operation. It was a real test of the crew's skills, which went off without a hitch. The patient was later transferred to the John Hunter in a stable condition.
A week of cloudy skies has made testing a solar vehicle difficult. Built for a national competition in Canberra this weekend, the model was designed by students at Newcastle's Merewether High. The car has no battery capacity and must be propelled by light alone. Students devised their own electrical components and drive mechanisms.
For the last year we've been going to the university and researching an electronic gear changing system which involves very complex sort of logic circuits, stuff like that. We've learnt a lot over the past year about it.
With a plasticine driver strapped into place, the students were keen to show off their creation. A barrage of artificial light failed to move the car. A piece of string was used to give an impression of their invention underway.
But on the weekend we're confident if it's sunny that it will go fast and hopefully place well.
Will you be taking your ball of string with you?
Yes.
Finally, a break in the weather and solar rays were harnessed to get the wheels rolling.
The printers formed a picket outside the Herald office this morning after going on strike last night. The workers say an enterprise agreement has been broken, with management putting on casual staff. A security officer has been called in by the company to ensure trucks aren't stopped from entering the property. Herald management says the paper will be printed by staff for the week the printers are on strike. And at Hamilton, students went to great heights to protest over Shell's involvement in new oil fields in Nigeria. After placing a protest banner on one of the company's giant oil tanks, 2 students were later questioned by police, but no charges were laid. The protesters say Shell is supporting the Nigerian dictatorship, which is alleged to have committed thousands of killings. They called on Shell to pull out of Nigeria. And in another protest, unionists picketed outside the Comalco aluminium office in Newcastle today in support of the miners involved in the CRA Weipa dispute. The group was collecting money to help the striking workers.
Seth Shevels from the Anglican welfare agency The Samaritans says his organisation is concerned about the number of homeless people on the Central Coast, particularly those aged between 12 and 16.
The Central Coast is experiencing a considerable growth, considerable higher levels of unemployment and considerable social change, and whenever you get all those things happening together, there are casualties, and at the present time young people are one of the casualties.
The Samaritans today announced its plan to provide a range of accommodation for homeless young people in the area.
That will comprise a house in Wyong where young people can receive emergency accommodation for 2 or 3 weeks until it's worked out what's best for them.
The Samaritans will also provide support services for young people living in housing. Jane Anderson, NBN News.
The Minister for Police, Paul Whelan, was made aware of officers' concerns over manning levels during a visit to Singleton and the Coalfields last September. Months on, and the government sat down to negotiations in Sydney. The government has committed itself to a 24-hour police service at Singleton, a station upgrade and more officers by next July. Retired former officers will be offered permanent part-time work to boost numbers.
Cessnock is going to have its answers solved in the short term by finding the surplus police in New South Wales and putting some of them here into Cessnock. In the long term, the government's commitment to increase police numbers are going to mean more police here in Cessnock.
And although there's the promise of more police, there's no immediate relief in sight for officers at Cessnock and Curry. Those stations will be facing the busy Christmas period with skeleton staff. A policy on minimum policing guidelines, or the bare essentials needed to effectively staff patrols, is being worked out and will be subject to police association meetings next month. Andrew Lobb, NBN News.
The Beresfield officers were back at the station today, but last night the one person on duty was transferred to Raymond Terrace, leaving the Beresfield area without an ambulance service.
If someone's crooking the town of Beresfield, the officer that normally would have been there to cover them is no longer there. It's the first time in the history of the Hunter that an ambulance station's been closed.
Work bans placed by the union that no stretcher patient will be picked up by a one-person crew has forced the ambulance service to transfer staff to make up two-person crews.
I decided that Beresfield could be covered from Rutherford or Raymond Terrace, given the fact that it's a fairly quiet workload station.
The station at Beresfield will be closed again tonight. The union says officers in the Newcastle area cannot continue to operate with one-person crews. The union says it's been overwhelmed with support from the public. Here at the ambulance base at Hamilton, at least 60 phone calls have come through from people congratulating the officers for their stand. Peter Ryan, NBN News.
The Greens emerged from the Land and Environment Court victorious.
Our assertions that this area is far too sensitive to be cleared has been vindicated by the court.
It comes less than a month after the National Parks and Wildlife Service granted RZM an interim licence to mine one of the richest reserves of rutile and zircon in the world. But Green groups claim the 22-hectare plot at Tomago near Newcastle was one of the most valuable koala habitats in the country and blockaded the site to prevent further clearing. They say today's decision vindicates their actions and has widespread ramifications for the rules in future environmental battles.
We are hoping that that Bob Carr's promised Endangered Species Conservation Bill that's going through the Parliament this year will have clear conservation outcomes, and that the environment movement won't have to take these actions in the courts in the future, that we will have real protection for our endangered species in New South Wales.
RZM says the decision could cost up to 30 jobs, and it will apply for a general licence which, if granted, will provide the company with the right to mine the site indefinitely. Richard O'Leary, NBN News.
South Wales.
People who nominated me, because I wouldn't have gotten this far if they didn't, to competitions in Sydney.
Sydney sailor Glenn Burke was unrivalled on the water, winning both heats today following his clean sweep yesterday. The 4 wins out of 4, giving Burke the title in his first Masters series. In the radial lasers, Sydney's Kevin Bluer and Canberra's Tony Ryan tied for first. To baseball, and in a remarkable comeback, the Hunter Eagles have won their 3-game series against the Gold Coast Cougars. The Eagles lost their first game on the Gold Coast by a record margin of 26-3. But last night, the Eagles won the second game 4-2 before taking the series with an 11-5 win in the third. But it hasn't been all good for the region's national teams, with the Breakers going down by a goal against Canberra. Australian captain Paul Wade was the destroyer, scoring a hat-trick.
The report details the state of the Lake Macquarie estuary. It found that erosion in Swansea Channel, particularly at Salts Bay and Pelican Flat, remains a problem.
The wave action into Salts Bay is removing the sand from Salts Bay, and this has been an ongoing process for most of this century, and carrying the sand down the channel to the drop over where it settles out.
Jeff Jansen says unless the area is stabilised, the erosion will cause irreparable harm to Blackned's Bay, the lake's most significant remaining wetland. The study also looked at water quality, finding that a number of tributaries didn't comply with relevant guidelines. It also recommended the assessment of water close to shore. The news, though, wasn't all bad. The water quality in the body of the lake was thought to be quite satisfactory. The next stage will be to prepare a report on how the lake should be managed.
We're currently waiting on the state government to advise of their contribution. They share this project on a 50-50 basis. Council has allocated its money.
Stage 2 is expected to cost a total of $130,000. Jane Anderson, NBN News.
This amateur video caught the storm in full flight. Hailstones as big as golf balls pounding this yard at Metford near Maitland. It lasted less than 20 minutes, but residents say it was just as savage as it was short.
I heard the noise and came out and it was just deafening. Couldn't really hear anything.
There's no estimate of the damage, but there have been reports of broken windows and dented cars. But for the children, it was like a white Christmas, even if it was a month early, giving them a rare chance to have a snow fight in summer. Meanwhile, Newcastle was treated to a spectacular lightning show off the coast. But the storm has left some residents without power, Orion Energy trying to restore electricity to Jules, Rutherford and Talara. Richard O'Leary, NBN News.
The fire brigade now has a frontline unit to fight outbreaks on boats or to deal with accidental spills of hazardous materials into drains or rivers. Called the Otter, the 5.3 metre vessel is powered by a 115 horsepower outboard motor. The craft is based at the Hazmat Squad in Sydney, but can be dispatched to any emergency throughout the state. It is crewed by 2 officers, but it can carry up to 8 firefighters as well as equipment. Its role is to mop up hazardous spills on the water, or it can use a high-powered pump to spray water onto any type of blaze, either marine vessels or bushfires only accessible by water. The $33,000 craft was commissioned earlier this month. The Otter showed its capabilities on Brisbane Water at Gosford today. Andrew Lobb, NBN News.
Yesterday's storm left Breakers Stadium in 30 centimetres of water. Staff worked overtime last night to drain the ground, and at 8:30 this morning tonight's game was to go ahead. But all that changed with another downpour, the ground deemed to be unsafe. Forced to experiment, the club is hoping for a good turnout at 7 o'clock on Sunday, which could become a more regular fixture.
It will give us some sort of gauge, and maybe we can look at Saturdays and Sundays for the future as well as Friday nights.
Meantime, the weather looks set to interrupt the Eagles ABL series at Maitland this weekend. At this stage, tomorrow's match with the Monarchs is still on, while a double header is set down for Sunday. Ironically, one of the few sports that could have gone ahead today was deferred due to flat conditions. The Australian school surfing titles will now have an extra 19 heats scheduled for tomorrow and Sunday at Newcastle Beach.
Jim Whitten found out he was HIV positive 12 years ago, but it's only been recently that he's become sick, in need of help. Marie Tute has been there for him. She's just one of a small band of volunteers working with the Community Support Network, an organisation that provides care to AIDS sufferers.
Doing a little bit of housework, often cooking a meal for them if they need it, if they're, and we also go to the hospital.
Jim's mother recently moved in with him, but he still needs assistance from Marie. She does household chores and also gives him emotional support.
People, I think, tend to believe that you just need material things to make your life comfortable, which they do. But the emotional support, the love, the caring, the devotion of these people, it does so much more for the person.
The theme of World AIDS Day this year is shared rights, shared responsibilities. At ceremonies like this one at Newcastle's John Hunter Hospital, the role of families, friends and volunteers who care for people with AIDS was acknowledged, and those who've died from the disease were remembered. Jane Anderson, NBN News.
The Faculty of Nursing has for years sweltered in overheated, ill-equipped classrooms, making life difficult for staff and students.
Hospital beds are constantly shunted around, and we have to make do with really inadequate space.
Due to the loss of teaching rooms at the Royal Newcastle Hospital in the earthquake, the school has had no clinical teaching rooms and is forced to get by without basics such as wash basins. Staff say their current home does not reflect the kind of image the nursing profession should be projecting. But all that is about to change, with an ultra-modern extension to the old building costing nearly $6 million.
To actually have a building that will look very presentable and attractive and in which we can take pride, I think is going to do a great deal for the morale of the faculty and for the pride which students need to take in their own faculty and their university.
The faculty expects its 1,000 students will be able to move into their new home by the beginning of the 1997 academic year. Laura Saperstein, NBN News.
The centrepiece of this year's Matara Festival was a huge parade that stopped the city. Organisers were happily surprised at what seemed to be a revival of interest in the festival, run on just $150,000 and an army of volunteers. Festivals of similar scale in cities such as Canberra and Brisbane are more heavily funded. The renewed interest in Newcastle's festival has led to calls for more facilities to cope with the crowds and also for more funding. At a meeting last night, committee members expressed hopes of integrating Matara with 1997 bicentenary celebrations, rather than having it overshadowed by the 200th birthday bash.